everyone, my name is Dustin and you're watching my channel, Tabletop Studios. Today I'm going to start a series of videos that revolves around Hail Caesar. I want to go through a series of videos that look at the content of this book and basically summarize it and give kind of like a visual learning video. This was suggested to me in a few emails by some of my subscribers and also on some forums that, hey, could you not only film battle reports, but could you go through like the different steps, different kinds of models, different items and rules in Hail Caesar? By the way, I don't think anyone's really done that in a series. So we're going to start here with the first chapter and make our way through each chapter. I don't have a set time on when this is going to be done, but we're going to make a set of videos that just cover all the basics of Hail Caesar. So let's start right away here, open the book, and I'll set everything up. Apologies for my dog, he continues to cry because his mother went into the other room. Anyways, let's take a look at the first bit that I'll go through here. Okay, so if you are getting into Hail Caesar, there are a few things that you are going to need in order to play. Okay, the very first thing, obviously, rule book. You need that. So get the rule book. You can get it in PDF form or you can get it as a the hardcover here that I've got. The second most essential thing you're going to need are dice. Of course, lots of games use dice. Hail Caesar uses six-sided dice. The next thing you're going to have to get is a form of like a ruler or a measuring tape. Okay, it's pretty standard in all war games. You're going to have to measure something when you move or shoot or get the range on something. The Hail Caesar uses inches, so anything with an inch marker on it will do. And of course, probably the thing you want to get are models. And here's a bunch. These models here that you see are all 28 millimeters. Hail Caesar was designed for models between, I think the rulebook says 25 to 30 millimeters. There's nothing stopping you in the game from using any size you want. Some people use 6 millimeters up to 15 millimeters. Whatever size you want to use, you are able to use as long as you and your opponent are okay with it. You may have to adjust some rules in certain areas and the like. But yeah, basically majority of people I've seen use 28 millimeter models. Tons of companies out there. Go check out Warlord Games, Victrix, lots of different companies make them. Another thing I'll add in here is that you should bring are these ones here, and I'll bring you up closer. You should bring some casualty or other markers. Now you could use beads or those gems that some people use in other games. I take model bits and pieces and base them on circle bases. So when my guys get wounded, I have something to put beside them and say, hey, that unit's taken a point of damage or a point of stamina damage, we say in Hail Caesar. So that's completely optional. You can write it on paper if you want, but otherwise, yeah, bring something or have a method to record wounds and damage. Another marker you could put on there is for units that are disordered or shaken or fleeing or breaking or something like that. So those are all things that Hail Caesar uses. It's not a whole lot for the game. Pretty standard stuff that most gamers and wargamers will already have. And obviously the last thing that you need is a board to play on. And I have a table here that's roughly a bit bigger than 6 by 4 feet. And you can see I've got a mat on there and I've got a bunch of terrain. Terrain is obviously an optional issue if you're playing for the first time, collecting for the first time. Just a flat table will do. I really recommend if you're playing smaller games that you go just 6 by 4 feet is fine. But if you want to get into big games, it gets crowded. So the bigger the games, the bigger the battle, you want a bigger table. That's all you really need for Hail Caesar. Pretty standard stuff for any wargamer. So once you got models all set up and organized, we're actually going to plug them into divisions. Now in Hail Caesar, like most war games, you're going to put your soldiers into units. Here I've got 2 units of Astadi, and then these guys spread out are skirmishers. It's a unit of just javelin throwing skirmishers, and I put them all together and I'm saying that's my division. The divisions are controlled by a commander, and the commander gives that division orders. So in Hail Caesar, it's ideal to have a number of divisions where your soldiers are split up. And if I pull my camera back here and focus in, you can see I've made kind of 2 divisions here. I've got, let's call it the Roman division on the left there, and they've got 3 units. And then on this side here, I've got 2 units of small Numidian warriors, we'll call them. and then an elephant. That's maybe what 2 divisions look like in the army. The commanders command that division, and one of your commanders will end up being the general. So these are kind of small. If you're playing with points and the supplements typically say 4 units or more excluding skirmishers. That's pretty standard. There are some exceptions in the rules where skirmishers make up a whole division. But if you want to play with points, you're typically going to have something like 4 of this kind of unit, or 4 of those. These are small units, and we'll get into sizes soon, but your divisions will probably look a little bigger than mine since I'm playing with Republican Romans. But yeah, all these divisions, when you put them together, make up the army. If you are just playing free-for-all, no points, it really doesn't matter how many units a division has. I have 3 and 3 here on either side. That's fine. The more units you put in a division, the harder it becomes because commanders have to give more command. They have a more chance of failing commands and then screwing up all your army. We'll get into that later. But yeah, typically for points, if you play with points, the rules are going to say 4 units and more. And I find that's perfectly fine. And how many divisions you want is totally up to you. If you've got like a massive table and you want 20 divisions and you can do that, yeah, just do it. You and your opponent can have a grand old time that way. If you're playing with 300, 500 points, you're going to be limited to the amount of units you have, so you will have to kind of doctor up a certain amount of units every division will be able to have. It should be said that it doesn't matter what kind of units are in a division without points, or even with points sometimes. You can mix the different troop types, and we're going to go over troop types next. But there's no problem having like 2 units of foot soldiers and 2 units of cavalry. It's all fine, as long as the one commander is in control of that division. No other commander will be able to control that division. So you might want all cavalry, you might want all infantry. It's up to you, all artillery. So, or you can just mix and match. You could have 2 infantry, 2 artillery, and 1 elephant if you want. So you get a lot of freedom to kind of set up the army the way you want to look, essentially. So kinds of troops in Hail Caesar. Let's start with infantry. An infantry troop type is basically anything that's on foot. That includes heavy infantry, like these hastati here, and medium and light infantry. They all have different advantages, or higher armor or lower armor values. We'll look at that later. The other type of infantry you could have running around are skirmishers, which are loosely based like this. They're a little lighter, and they operate a little differently than the formed fellows like these guys in the back. The other kind of infantry you may have are commanders, but they don't really count. Commanders don't have a troop type, but a lot of commanders will be on foot and cavalry. It doesn't matter. I'll show you that later as we get towards it. Of course, you're also going to have cavalry. Cavalry are obviously any kind of troop that's mounted on either a horse or a camel or a war bear. Well, if you're doing Hail Caesar fantasy, I don't know. But I don't have any painted up, but there's a cavalryman in the back. They are going to be typically what you think, fellows on horses. The other unit type that I don't have in my collection at all are chariots. There's light chariots and heavy chariots, which operate quite differently, I think, and we'll look at that later on as we're going through. Another item I don't have set up is the artillery. Artillery is also a type of troop, and they have their own set of rules. The bigger it is, the farther it shoots. However, the smaller it is, the more mobile it is, which makes sense. And we'll look at all of that too. One of the people's favorite is the elephant. Elephants are always a single model. Elephants are always a single model, and they're quite fun to have. Lots of people get elephants and love using them. So you'll probably see them a lot if you're playing the eras that use the elephants. And lastly, the last kind of troop type out there would be wagon and baggage. That's basically army supplies, and you typically do not see those items in pitched battles or in even point games. They're not really included. Wagon and baggage you'll probably see as decorative or in scenarios. Maybe you set up a scenario with your friend and you're like, whoever destroys the other person's baggage wins the game first, right? You probably will not see a lot of wagon and baggage in my games unless we decide to end up playing some cool scenario. So that's all the basic kind of troop types that this game offers. They are armed in different ways, and we'll cover that later on. They've got different stats. And we'll take a look at the stats now, just a general idea of what the stats will look like. So here in front of me, I've got a little pamphlet, a little paper from the old Hail Caesar Conquest of Gaul starter kit. And this was a little pamphlet or paper with unit stats they put in there for people to get started in small scale games. But on it, it shows you the different unit statistics. So this is a typical chart. You'll see it in the rule book, you'll see it in the supplement book, all over the place. Basically, on the left you've got the unit type, and the unit tells you the kind of infantry or cavalry, whatever kind of troop type it is, if it's heavy, medium or light, and then it also tells you what it's armed with. In this case we're looking at these legionnaires, right? These legionnaire heavy infantry armed with the pilum. This is the spot you look to see what your unit has, and that's important to look at this because it'll tell you what weapons, advantages, and what they do. Like if it says slings, you're going to have bonuses for having slings. In this case we have the pilum, so the pilum has bonuses in combat. Combat here is split up into clash, sustained, short range, and long range. Clash is your initial fighting value. This is what you use when you charge or are charged. It's for the first round of fighting. The Romans here are typically always 7. So in the first round of combat, you're going to have a 7 clash. But if you look down at these Celts, look at their clash jumps to 9. So when they charge, or they get charged, when they first start fighting, they're going to have like 9. And what does that 9 mean? It means how many dice you're allowed to roll. Okay? You'll notice here though after, the sustained. Sustained is for all subsequent combat rounds. So after the initial fighting of a new unit, you can see that these Gauls, or these Britons, whatever they are, they drop down to 6. So they're not as heavy hitting as they were in the clash. So you want to break through units, because if you're fighting the Romans, it doesn't matter if they've clashed or charged and gone on to the second round. They still have 7. So typically a lot of troops have different strengths and weaknesses depending on their type. And war bands like these Celts have a good clash, but then they drop down to the typical medium 6, so they're not as good as they are when they first charge in or get charged. The next dice amount is short range, and short range is used for any kind of attack. That's, I think it's 6 inches, and they use 3 dice here for the Romans. It's also used for support, which we'll get into later. You can see they've got 3, and these Britons only have 2. I don't like using war bands to support each other, because they're just as good as skirmishers, you'll see later. And the last value these guys don't have on is long range. Long range is for the dice amount you want to roll for like weapons that shoot like bows, or artillery, like scorpions that shoot over long distances. Obviously these pilums can only be thrown so far, and same with these guys, they only have javelins here. They can't throw in long range. The other stats you have are morale save. Your morale save is basically your armor. You have to roll a 4+ when you get hit by something to save a wound. You get 4+ here because they're heavy infantry. That's typical for heavy infantry. These Celts are buffed. They've got a moral save of 4. Typically that's not the case. Most Celts that you play with in points are 5 and up as medium troops. But I guess they modified it just for the starter pack here. The last one you have is stamina. Stamina I always consider to be your HP. That's how many wounds you take until your unit starts to get shaken, and bad things happen when you get to stamina 6. If you double that, your unit is outright destroyed, and we'll go all over that later on. And the last thing at the end of each unit type they will have special, and special just puts in certain rules that they're able to adopt or use while they're playing. In this case, the legionnaires have testudo, which is the famous tortoise formation, and drilled, and we'll go over those later on. These guys have wild fighters, so every unit, some units don't have any special abilities, but most units have something. And it's typical of history. Like if you look at the pikemen, they're going to have special rules that would say, oh, you know, they drilled with their pikes, they're going to be drilled. And the hoplites are the phalanx rule or something like that. So you'll see all these stats all throughout. It's good to know them, and they'll be available for you no matter what you play with, if you just have the rule book or have points. And that's basically all for statistics. So, we're going to look at a unit and the unit's leader. Can you tell in this group of Hastati which guy is my leader? If you guessed this one, you're wrong. It's him. He is the leader. Leaders in the unit typically go to the center. What do leaders do for units? Honestly, absolutely nothing. They do not have any bonus. They don't give you anything special. Even the standard bearer here and the musician, which I put in the back, in Hail Caesar, those are only used for aesthetics. The benefit of having a leader and command group is that it marks out the center front of the unit. That's important because Hail Caesar measures a lot and lines up a lot from the center front. So it's important to at least have a model or some marker that represents the center of your unit. In this case, because I have 4 models across, I guess the center would be the line between this guy and this guy. Where if you have, you know, an odd number of soldiers, it's very easy to put a leader or someone recognizable in the middle. But yeah, in this game, basically, the leader of a unit is nothing but aesthetic and marks the center of your unit. Now, one important thing we're going to have to look at are the basing in Hail Caesar. You can see I've got a movement tray on these particular fellows, but each one of these infantrymen are either on, here you can see if I pull him up, he's on a 20 by 20 millimeter base, but these guys in the middle, all 4 of them are on a 40 by 40 millimeter base, 4 guys on there. Okay, so how did I figure this out? How did I know how to base them? Basically, in Hail Caesar, you're going to be using your typical wargaming basing items. 20 millimeter bases or 40 millimeter bases. There's a whole bunch out there. And you can modify the basing. You don't have to follow this chart I'm about to read off here. But typically in Hail Caesar, you'll want to match up your soldiers like this. Infantry are typically a single model on a 20 by 20 base. Cavalry, which I have one back here. This guy's on a 25 by 50 base. If you're looking at chariots, they could be on a 40 by 80 or even 80 by 80 millimeter base. It really depends how many horses are carrying it. The rules will tell you, or the armies will tell you how to do that. Elephants here are on 80 by 80 millimeter bases. They're basically the same size of what I'm using for my small units frontage here. We'll talk about frontages soon. Light artillery says it's 40 by 60. And the medium and heavy they put at 60 by 100 millimeters. So you can see there's a whole bunch of different base types. Do you have to follow those base sizes? Absolutely not. You can use round bases if you want to. You do not have to use square bases in Hail Caesar. You just have to figure out a way to line them up that they'll match your opponent or fit in a unit. These guys are all in rank and file, and you can see here that I have these guys that are also on Rendera 25 or 20 millimeter bases, rather 20 by 20 millimeter bases, but they are in skirmish formation, so they don't sit together. Finally, there's bases for commanders. Commanders have special bases in the fact that they don't follow a standard. You can put them on any base you want. I think I've got some Warhammer 40k base from Citadel here for my commander. They don't go in the unit, so they can be any kind of base they want to be. If I wanted to, this elephant, I could say, this elephant is my commander, and he'd be fine. The important part is the head. The head is the important part of the commander. It's where it's measured from. So whatever your base is, it doesn't matter really for commanders. I put them on round bases, while the rest of my soldiers are on rectangular or square bases. And as the rulebook says here, the base sizing really doesn't matter. If you're playing with smaller size, like 6 or 15 millimeter, you may want to adjust their base sizing. They're pretty liberal on it. You can just open up the book and find where it talks about bases, and you can modify it. All the stuff I just rattled off is your typical 28 millimeter standard base sizing. It matches a lot of games. If you want to be the safest possible, base everything on 20 by 20 millimeter bases, and you can play probably any game with your models. I should quickly add in too, when you're doing bases, the model count in your unit doesn't really matter. Some people with their warbands, and I do this too, if they have like a 40 millimeter base, they only put 3 guys on it. Okay? The important thing is the actual size of the base, not so much how many soldiers are on it. It just looks better for rank and file if they're close together like this. In warbands where there is no order, I just personally think they look better mangled up and haphazardly placed. So it's totally up to you how you want to build them. Again too, with the commander, you do not have to use just one guy. I mean, the commander, the model on there that is the commander is the important part. You could make a cool diorama. You could like triple the size of his base, have the commander in the middle, and have like a whole bunch of bodyguards around him, just for show if you want, which would make sense. I mean, the commander, is he going to be walking around by himself? Probably not. The bodyguard don't really mean anything. They're just there as for show and aesthetic. So however you want to design a base, if you want to have a base like this for your commander, or if you want to have a fancy elephant where the guy up there, I can turn him here. I gave him a sword. I put a sword on him. He could be the commander of these Numidians. He'd no longer have the stats of the elephant, but he'd look pretty impressive as a commander, right? Next we're going to talk about the size of units. Now I'm not going to get into the sizing in too much detail. I'll just go over the basics that I know. And the bases are very simple to state and point out. But for the size of unit, it really varies. Hail Caesar lets the players have a lot of choices and a lot of liberty to make their army as big or as small as they want. So typically, we'll go over the frontages here first. Units use frontages in Hail Caesar. They don't use model count so much. The important part in Hail Caesar is how wide your unit's front is. So here I've got guys on 40mm bases. My frontage here is 40, 80, 120, 160. I use 160mm here for my frontages. And typically you should keep your frontages for all the types of units you have in your armies the same. Okay, and it should be similar to your opponents, just to be fair. I don't think you have to have them the same, but ideally you should try and match them the same as your opponent, because then it just makes, you know, you can have heavy infantry fight heavy infantry with the same frontage as a standard unit, and they can line up and match up properly, or smaller units can get in there and it'll be more fair. So if you're playing with a group of friends, you have to figure out in the rulebook what kind of frontage you want. In my group we use 160mm because that seems like that's the standard. So that would be either 4 of these 40mm bases, or you'd have 8 20mm bases. Now units have different sizes, and typically a standard unit is whatever frontage you've chosen. So in my situation, it's 160mm. A small unit, like these fellows here, they're also infantry. They are half the size of the standard, so it's 80mm. You can see here how they're not as wide. So a smaller unit is going to have perhaps only half of the frontage of a standard unit. That also means they've lost some stats, and we'll look at that as well too, but smaller units don't have as much clash or sustained or support because they are smaller, so it makes more sense that more men are going to be doing more damage, right? There's also large units. Large units are basically double the standard, so here I would field 320mm in the games I play. This is something you're just going to have to go find the rule book and figure out on your own, but whatever frontage you decide, you can mix and match. Like, if somebody wanted to play with 150mm and then say their large units are 320, which is more than double of 150, that's fine, as long as you and your opponent are all good with it. Sometimes we even play with 10mm differences. Like this unit here is technically 90mm because his movement trait spawns out, but if I'm playing and I'm gonna fight, say, this guy, I will still try to line up. You can see here that the movement tray overextends, but I'm still gonna try and line up in a way, or say, okay, it's still 80mm between the unit, not the actual movement tray. So yeah, it's something you have to read through. It's not difficult to understand once you get into it, but once you figure out a frontage, you can just build your units around that. Another kind of unit size are for skirmishers. Now, skirmishers don't really have sizes. It's just a group of guys throwing things, or shooting bows, or throwing sling rocks. They don't have a size or a frontage, really. They're just individual models. I should mention that since they don't really fight, you can even put them on circle bases while the rest of your army has square bases. You can figure it out later on your own. But they don't have a frontage, and they can be as few or as many as you like. We typically do 8. This one's kind of short too. But 8 seems to be the standard amount for skirmishers. And just to put this guy up here for fun, another type of size would be for tiny units. Tiny units are like a couple models, if not even a couple, just one model. You're typically not going to see tiny units in a lot of games. The smallest will be like the skirmishers I just explained. But if you're doing a scenario where there is a guy running around and he's like an individual, you will find stats in the rulebook for tiny units. Again, it's just a couple models. They might have frontages depending how you set it up, but they're really not that imposing or that intimidating on the battle versus like one guy versus all of these guys. Who's gonna win, right? Unless he's Superman, of course, these guys. And again, I stress here, the frontages do not really matter for the amount of models in the unit. I could have 160 millimeters here, but if I really wanted to save time on painting, I could put one guy here, one guy here, one guy here, one guy here. It would look kind of odd and very spaced out, but as long as the bases match the frontage you're going for, that's all fine. For the actual depth of a unit, the depth doesn't matter so much. In Hail Caesar, there's only a few units, which I'll go through, that have a depth requirement. For these guys here, I have 2. Typically, you can see these guys have a depth of 2, and these guys have a depth of 2. Skirmishers don't really have depth. They're all over the place. But I could, if I wanted to, add another line in the back here. It would do nothing for the game other than my opponent could come in and flank. So even then, it doesn't really matter because the opponent can still flank pretty close. It's only a model, 20 millimeter difference. Anyway. So for collection purposes, if you just have tons of models you love to display, put them in 3 ranks or 4 ranks. It won't matter. The important part is the frontage of the unit. And you can see I put them all in 2, and that just saves us time and space when we're playing. If you want to put 6 in a rank, you're fine with that, just go right at it. The stats will stay the same and the frontage should be the same. It's worth to mention though that some units have different depths, like elephants. They say 80 by 80 millimeters in the book, but you may want to adjust that. I don't know for what purposes, but they could have, maybe you want 80 by 90. As long as the frontage is 80, then it's all good. The artillery too and chariots may have different depths depending on what kind of bases you want to put them on. Like I said, you don't have to put them all on the bases the rulebook says, but ultimately it's the frontage in this game that matters the most. So saying all that, typically the amount of models is going to match your frontage, especially if you're doing by every 20 millimeter, right? So if these guys here are 20 millimeters, like 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, 160, right? So that would mean that it's 8 guys across. That's how you measure the size, but honestly, the amount of soldiers, like I said, in a unit doesn't matter. Ultimately, you want the frontage in a unit to be consistent. Casualty markers, you will want something to label the stamina loss on your units. I got round bases with some Warhammer skeleton heads on them. I got a Gaul here that's dead. I got to bloody up his leg. And then I've just kind of got this diorama with this shield, old pillar, and it's half a skeleton there. And I put numbers on them. However you want your casualty markers to look is up to you. You can use coins, beads, gems, whatever you got lying around. Or make little models like I did.